Good afternoon and evening, everyone, and welcome to Stamp Talks presented by the Royal Philatelic Society of Canada. Today we have Garfield Porch, who will be speaking to us about the Steamboat Mail of Lake Ontario. Now, if you don't know Garfield, then you've been asleep. Garfield is a member and fellow of the RPSC, where he can use in an administrative role in the national office. After retiring in 2007, Garfield was invited to join the Vint Graves Green Philatelic Research Foundation. He has since joined the expert committee, become the forensic expert. He was previously elected president of the VGG Foundation, and now he continues his relationship with the foundation as a director and member of the executive committee and the expert committee. And oh my goodness, his philatelic credentials are like this long, and I have super truncated it because otherwise we will be here till next week. We would like to thank Longley Auctions, our sponsor for Stamp Talks and Stamp Panels. Longley Auctions is a public auction firm specializing in selling Canadian postal history, large worldwide collections, stamps, postcards, philatelic literature, and you know what? Bill's just an all-around nice guy. So be sure to check out longleyauctions.com. And when you're ready, Al, please play the land acknowledgement for us.
Like many other organizations in Canada, the Board of Directors of the Royal Philatelic Society of Canada has chosen to acknowledge Indigenous peoples in Canada with the following statement. As a step towards reconciliation, the RPSC acknowledges that our national office in Toronto stands on the traditional territory of many First Nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. Our national office is also covered by Treaty 13 and the Williams Treaties. Furthermore, we acknowledge that Indigenous peoples did not give up the lands that they had been on for thousands of years that now constitute Canada. We also acknowledge that Europeans did not discover Canada or arrive on an uninhabited land. The RPSC acknowledges that Canada is covered by many treaties and modern lands, resources, and self-government agreements with Indigenous peoples, and that the provisions of many of these arrangements remain unfulfilled. The RPSC further acknowledges that many Indigenous peoples in Canada have not had their rights fully recognized and implemented according to the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. The RPSC pledges to promote recognition and knowledge of Indigenous peoples in Canada and elsewhere and their cultures through philately. We will also work towards building positive relationships with Indigenous peoples in Canada.
Thanks, Al. All right, without further ado, we are going to give the time over to Garfield.
Thank you, Lisa. Much appreciate the introduction and the opportunity to present on the Royal Stamp Talks and Stamp Panels. It's always fun to get the word out there. The subject I wanted to talk about tonight, I guess I should probably get it up on the screen, shouldn't I? Makes it a little more fun for folks. Just trying to got this crazy band across here that doesn't let me get to the.
It says you've started. Okay, there we go.
There we
Now
go.
we see your screen.
And now let me get to the slideshow and from the beginning. And I think we're in business.
Yes, sir.
We are in business. This is a crazy subject that I haven't been working on all that long. I've only been working on it for 2 years. And it came about out of my study of the postal history of Toronto, which I've been working on for 40 years. And it recently dawned on me that mail did run in and out of Toronto on steamboats, as well as by rail and all the other routes. And 2 years ago at Orapex, I was given an opportunity to buy half a dozen fairly expensive covers, and I thought, good start to a good project. So that was the origin. At the time, I didn't realize that the covers weren't going to be as plentiful as I thought they were. steamboat mail on Lake Ontario is relatively scarce. Um, so I guess the questions I got to ask to make this whole thing make sense is why does it matter? Um, well, it matters because Toronto or York at the time was really a landlocked gang of only about 220 souls um, living in the site of what is now the downtown eastern part of the city of Toronto. To the east and the west was completely forested. There were no roads going either direction. Uh, the only real road leaving Toronto was Yonge Street, which went up to Lake Simcoe. So Toronto or York had to find a way to correspond with Queenston and Niagara uh, for two reasons. One is that Queenston was the previous capital of Upper Canada, and there was a lot of business still running out of Queenston. And of course, it was also the route to get mail into the United States and down to the East Coast, so we could have overseas mail. Why is it so hard to find? Well, this is a little bit of a study of geography. Um, you're not going to find too many letters when there aren't too many people around to write the letters. Um, in the mid 1820s, which is about the beginning of this whole study, Hamilton had a population of 200 souls. York was somewhere around 2,000 to 2,200. Oshawa only had about 100 to 150. Kingston, which was one of the major communities on Lake Ontario, had about 2,500. Rochester, New York, about 1,500. And Queenston was only 300 to 400 people. And that was a major center. So there's not a lot of people to write letters. And of those who were in York, probably half of them were military. And the other half were either government officials or farmers. So there's not really too much of a cause to write letters. Um, we want to look at the ports of call on Lake Ontario. Well, I kind of hit that with the population list. Um, but the routes were so informal that they would pretty much stop anywhere that was necessary. Um, the steamboats weren't there to carry the mail, they were there to carry freight and passengers, and the mail was an incidental uh, process, and a very informal process and not well documented. Uh, Captains of boats were paid a penny to deliver a letter by hand to the first postal station along the route. So if somebody was stopping, say at Darlington and on between Toronto and Oshawa, they might pick up a letter that they would drop off at Kingston. So there's no record of it being carried by mail. It's just a letter that entered the postal system at Kingston. So that makes it fairly tough to score covers for the whole process. And of course, in around 1856, there was a transition to mail by rail. I will show you a letter or the wording of a letter later on, which really was the death knell of mail on Lake Ontario. So why does it matter? Here is the letter that Peter Russell, who was the chief administrator for York, stated that we needed a safe means of communicating by water with the other parts of the province. So that was really the driving fact with getting mail started. Uh, the response was to launch the schooner Toronto, and that was in about 1799. So you're before steamboats there. The main points that they wanted to hit with the steamboats, as you can see, are Kingston, Cobourg, Toronto, Hamilton, Niagara, Lewiston, Rochester, and Oswego. There were other spaces in between. As I said, the boats stopped wherever the boat stopped. Why is it so hard to find? Well, there's your population numbers. Um, and if the people aren't there, the letters certainly aren't going to be. Um, there may be probably more letters going back across the ocean to Great Britain and other points in Europe than there are back and forth across the lake. Most of the mail back and forth across the lake was either legal or banking or business material. People just didn't, write a letter from York to Coburg saying, "Hey, the weather's fine here, and Mrs. Murphy's pigs died." The informal part of the whole process is that much of the mail in Upper Canada at the time and surrounding Lake Ontario never entered the postal system. It was just carried by favor, and many letters were carried by the captains as a courtesy. And of course, they got their penny a letter as well for carrying them. Several letters that never even got to the captains were just carried by favor by passengers. Um, and I think anybody who was going anywhere that they were going to travel by boat put out the word around the community saying, I'm going to Queenston or I'm going to Rochester. If you've got any mail, I'll tote it with me and save you the cost of the postage. A huge fact is that very few of the officially posted letters had any kind of markings that indicated they were carried on the steamboat. Steamboat official markings are scarce. Um, and I know that with exhibits and so on, you shouldn't use the word scarce or rare, but they were scarce. Very few were used. Um, a high percentage of the steamboat mail only received a marking at the receiving office. I know some of the mail coming into Toronto had a special hand stamp, which I will show you. Some going into Niagara had a special hand stamp, and anything else was informal. And of course, the key thing is that on Lake Ontario, we have a navigation season. So there's no mail going during the dead of the winter. Everything's going overland at that time. Um, the nature of the mail is also interesting in that, as I said, the letters are mainly commercial correspondence. Um, and the nature was governed by the fact that very little formal handling was evident anywhere in the process. So here's the first boat that carried mail on Lake Ontario. It's the Steamboat Frontenac, um, built at Ernestown, which is down near Kingston. 50 horsepower motor, so she traveled at 10 kilometers an hour, and ran a route between Prescott, Kingston, York, and Niagara. So it was kind of a slow boat, um, working in a small community. It never paid for itself. A, a commercial loser all the way, but very important. And there is the pride and joy of my collection. It's one of the three only covers known to bear the Steamboat Frontenac hand stamp. Um, there are other letters out there from the Frontenac that didn't get hand stamped at the time. Um, paid the standard rate, 1 shilling, so that's one shilling and no pence for a single sheet letter traveling 300 to 400 miles. So it's from York to Toronto. The only way that you know it's from York is it's internal docketed. And of course, the Kingston receiving mark showing 22nd of October, 1818. Here's one off the transit, and pretty much the popular boat that ran between Niagara and Toronto, or Niagara and York, although this was a City of Toronto hand stamp, one of the nice early ones. For those who don't study Toronto, you'll find that there's two iterations of that hand stamp, one in the red and one in black. And the reason for that is that when Howard took over as postmaster in Toronto in 1828 or 1826, he wrote to the Postmaster General saying, "I like the red hand stamp they're using in Montreal. Can I use red in York?" And he got an affirmative answer. So he was granted the privilege of hand stamping all the York and Toronto stuff in red. When he got fired in 1839 following the Mackenzie Rebellion, the permission to use the red hand stamp expired with his termination, and they had to revert to black. Um, so that's the only significance of the red and black hand stamp. But the significant thing here, it's a letter on the transit coming from Niagara to Toronto. And the reason that you know that it's a steamboat letter is, first of all, it's the transit, but secondly, it's the rate of 4.5 pence. 4.5 was the rate for a letter traveling up to 60 miles. If it was more than 60 miles, up to 100, the rate would be 7 pence. So if that letter had gone around the end of the lake through Hamilton and into Toronto, all overland, it would have been a 7 pence letter. But coming across the lake, it's only about 36 miles, and then the rate is 4.5 pence. And that's how you determine whether it's a boat letter or an overland letter in most cases. This is a fascinating letter that I've always liked. Um, it started out its trip to England as a steamboat letter. And we know it here because you can see the screwy little rate, 4.5 and 25. And I think I show it better further on. And no, I don't. 4.5 and 25. The 4.5 pence takes it from Toronto across the lake to Niagara. Uh, then it crosses over into Lewiston, and it's 25 cents from Lewiston to New York City. And New York City is where it got on the steamboat, and it went to England. So there's your 4.5 and 25, and that's a relatively scarce hand stamp. But I say that was all prepaid. The rest of the rating, you notice there's honking big 8 in the middle, and that was an incoming ship fee that was put on in Portsmouth. So every incoming letter was subject to a tax of 8 pence sterling. And of course, there's your black City of Toronto hand stamp as well. This letter being 1840. This is one of my favorite covers. Um, this is the incoming hand stamp from Niagara. There are only 4 examples of this recorded, and it, it was applied at Niagara to indicate that the letter was carried by steamboat. And of course, here's again the 4.5 pence, um, indicating that it's the shorter route. But the letter is internally dated York, and it was posted on board whatever boat it was at Toronto. I shouldn't have said York. It was Toronto. Apologies for that. And here's one coming the other way from Niagara to Toronto, and it was posted on board whatever boat it was, possibly the transit, who knows. Um, Again, this is the weakness of the fact that they didn't record all this stuff. And it's 4.5 pence. And because it was posted on board the boat, the postage was not prepaid. So, and as many of you will be aware, that mandatory prepayment was not required till 1875. So the letter was mailed with no postage, just dropped into the box on the deck, brought into Toronto, delivered to the post office, where they applied the City of Toronto hand stamp, the steamboat marking, and 4.5 cents or 4.5 pence to be collected from the addressee. And again, Niagara to Toronto. This is just a nicer example of the steamboat arched hand stamp. This is not anywhere near as scarce as the one going into Niagara, but this letter just happens to have nicer postal markings, so it had to be grabbed by yours truly. And again, there's the 4.5 pence indicating the short rate, and evidenced by the steamboat postal marking. Now here's a piece of mail that is going to New York. And again, it was posted at Toronto, heading off to New York in 1843. So we can see that it's posted in Toronto. and you can see the word paid and the 9. So it's a double weight letter. Double the 4.5 pence is 9 pence. And it's, as you can see here, it's paid to the lines. And the payment was made through the sender's mailbox at the post office. So box number 20, which happens to be the Central Bank of the Midland District, box 20. And research will tell us that Dr. Kennedy in New York, and you'll see lots of mail going to Kennedy in New York, but he was a director of the Commercial Bank of the Midland District. So they paid to the lines. When it got to Queenston and transferred across to Lewiston, they scrubbed out the paid 9 and put in 50 cents, which is 25 cents to New York, but doubled because it's a double weight letter. That's kind of a scarce marking and a scarce rate combination. This one's Toronto to Rochester, and again the same thing applied. It was posted at Toronto, marked paid, and the 4.5. So that got it to Rochester. It's not. I'm sorry. I'm lying because that's a Lewiston marking on there. I must have been wide asleep. The letter was sent to Rochester via Lewiston. There's your problem. So 4.5 pence across the lake and 10 cents from Lewiston to Rochester. Here's an example of a privately carried cover, and we know it was on the Lady because there's the Lady boat. The Lady of the Lake was an American-owned steamboat, and haven't been able to determine it, beyond any shadow of a doubt yet. But I think that the Lady of the Lake was owned by the Bundy family, or at least by one of the Bundy businesses. And the reference inside was that this chap's writing home to his mother, Mrs. Bundy, and he says, "We're putting it on our boat." So that's how I got that kind of a connection. But there's absolutely no postal markings. It was just given to the captain, and probably give it to Mum when you get there. Here's a letter from Oswego to Port Stanley. Now, so it had to come across the lake, and we know that Port Stanley is essentially the middle of the north side of Lake Erie. So the letter is posted from Oswego, 9 pence to Toronto. So it's again a double weight letter across the lake to Toronto. And then Toronto forwards it to Port Stanley overland. So it would have gone by a combination of rail and carriage. Fairly straightforward process, and it was carried on the Admiral. So again, this is one of the rare cases where somebody has indicated on the cover the boat that it would be traveling on. And there's an illustration of the Admiral, owned by Donald Bethune, and ran a route from, there we are, Oakville, Port Credit, Toronto, and Port Hope. In 1846, it was made one of the boats that was given a formal contract for the carriage of mail. But up until 1846, it was just a post office privateer, I guess is the best description of that. Again, mail coming from Rochester to Toronto, and we can see the Rochester hand stamp. Again, the 4.5 pence paid across the lake. I'm not sure why they didn't mark it 10 cents, because it was coming out of the U.S., so it should have been posted with U.S. postage, but it was unpaid, so the whole thing to be collected in Toronto. Whoops. Here's one that I found a lot of fun. I've never seen a letter before I got this one with a private service on it. So this was a letter that was mailed in New York City, but it wasn't posted directly to the U.S. Post Office. It was picked up by this Boyd's City Express service, who charged 2 cents. And apparently they ran a business that went through the business district in downtown New York, picking up mail, charging 2 cents a pop, and delivering that mail to the U.S. Postal Service. Rather a lucrative little business, and I guess saving the various businesses the cost of getting somebody to hand deliver a letter to the post office. So Boyd's Express gets it into the post office on August the 29th, and there's the 10-cent rate to Lewiston, where it was transferred over to Queenston, and then sent across lake by steamer. I received at Toronto on September the 2nd. The U.S. postage of 10 cents here converts to 6 pence, and 6 pence U.S. postage plus 4.5 pence. Local postage in Canada makes 10.5, and there's your 10.5 pence to be collected by the Thorn addressee. It's kind of crazy trying to figure out some of these rates. Here's one of the earliest ones that does have an indicator that it was an onboard steamboat. That was applied at Rochester. So the letter was posted at Toronto, paid to the lines, rated 12 cents. So 12 cents was 2 cents to the captain and 10 cents U.S. inland postage. So it was paid all the way and through a charge box number 228 in Toronto, and again off to our friend Kennedy in New York. Thank goodness he saved a lot of his mail. 1846. This letter just shows that all mail wasn't subject to the same procedure. Here's a letter that's mailed in Toronto. It's paid 9 pence, which would get it to the lines, but there's no further markings on here indicating how it got from the post office in Lewiston through to New York. I'm sure that they put it in the U.S. postal system, but who paid the freight there? I have no idea. There's just no marking on the front or the back, just simply forwarded on. Here we have Niagara to Port Colborne. And this can be a fun study trying to find all the permutations and combinations of starting points and end points, but doesn't seem to be all that much mail going into Port Colborne. But the other interesting thing on this one is that the use of the too late hand stamp. Obviously, they missed the boat on October the 12th, and it was received on the 13th, but it was too late to go on the boat on the 13th, so it was sent off on whatever the next boat was. Date is unrecorded. And again, paid the 4.5 pence. Kind of a messy little cover. But it did get into Port Colborne on the 16th. So I presume that the boats ran every other day. I haven't been able to find a schedule yet, but October the 13th would have gone on the 14th or the 15th and delivered on the 16th. Here's another one to Port Stanley, and this one I've got a little map. There's where Port Stanley is, just down here, so it had a short overland run, probably by horseback. But this route from Toronto through to Port St. Thomas may well have been by rail. This is a triple rated letter, 1 shilling, 1.5 pence, from Kingston to Port Stanley, received at Toronto, and Toronto applied the Arch Steamboat hand stamp indicating the method of transit. Thus ends the period of totally freelance ship mail. In 1843, the Post Office Department entered into a contract with a number of steamboats to carry the mail essentially across the north shore of Lake Ontario, so between Hamilton and Kingston. Kingston and Hamilton being uh, the ends of both runs. They couldn't go any further than Kingston because of the rapids, and they couldn't go any further than Hamilton because there's nothing further on the water. But they did apply a hand stamp indicating uh, the steamboat service. And there was a conductor on board who handled the mail on behalf of the post office. April 23rd, 1848. There's a Toronto to Montreal letter. And you'll find a fair amount of postage or mail between Toronto and this guy Smith, who was a lawyer in Montreal. And he seemed to be a lawyer for a number of financial institutions in Toronto and excuse me, received a lot of mortgage mail and loan payments. So it's a money letter, which is the forerunner of registered mail, posted at Toronto, postage of again a shilling 1.5 pence, unpaid. So the recipient expected the guy who's receiving the money to pay the freight. In this case, the onboard conductor has written all of his receiving information here. So you've got conductor number 6, marks as a steamboat letter, picked up at Toronto on April 23rd, 1848. So that's everything that was required by the post office to put on every letter that they handled. When the government finally got around to issuing a hand stamp, there's the same information. The fact that it's a steamboat mail, it's from Toronto, October the 19th, 1848, and it's conductor number 6. Here we have the same thing with conductor number 3. This is the only conductor number 3 I've ever seen. 1 and 2, by the way, were out of Kingston. They were not out of Toronto. 3, 4, and 5 were out of Toronto, and number 6, I believe, was out of Hamilton. Or no, sorry, number 6 was out of Toronto. But I'd never seen a number 3 before. It's not listed in the official records as existing, but obviously it does because it says 3 and it says Toronto. There's number 5 out of Toronto. A very weak, messy cancellation here, and had to do some work to enhance it to that point. And I must admit, I used the VSC 8000 at the Green Foundation to do that little project. And Kingston to Coburg, so there's no number on the Kingston steamboat letters. Again, Kingston is a tough one to find. There aren't that many. Here's a lovely one that Bethune didn't have hand stamps for all of his boats, but on 3 letters that we know of, they just wrote Steamboat in a mauve colored marking. 3 of them have survived. I don't know why there aren't more. I guess we'll just have to keep on guessing on that one. But there was his steamboat, the Princess Royal. All good things have to come to an end. And on October the 21st, 1856, the Post Office Department in Kingston wrote a letter to all of the steamboat conductors on Lake Ontario saying that the railway has now been completed between Montreal and Toronto. We're going to move the mail that way, and as a result, your job is closed. So the expiring steamboat mail from the 27th of October to be superseded by conveyance of mail on the Grand Trunk Railway. And you are being offered a job on the railway as a second-class clerk if you wish to take it. So that was sort of that was a definite end to the process. Interestingly enough, I found a letter written on the 21st, the same day, a steamboat arriving in the Toronto harbor, announcing that there is some freight to be picked up. Whether mail was carried on that boat or not, I have no way of knowing. I've never seen anything else, but I thought that was an interesting little piece to have. And to finish it off, there's a letter that was posted in Toronto on December the 18th, and it's back-stamped Quebec on December the 19th. So the only way it could have got there is by rail. And there's what the mail trains looked like in 1856. Uh, an engine, a passenger car, and in the middle was the rolling post office. And that was the end of the contract steamboat mail on Lake Ontario. There was still some informal stuff that went after that, but after 1856, it was all up on rail, and the steamboat service on Lake Ontario officially died. And that's the end. So I thank you very much for watching, and I will be very happy to answer any questions that you ask that for which I'm able to answer.
Thank you, Garfield. That's fantastic. It's amazing how time progresses and ships became obsolete due to the rail. It's great that you were able to capture that information.
It was a nice find, and I got to give BNA Topics a credit for that when I was reading their railway mail study group, and I found that letter. Love to find the original letter. That would be a prize to have in the collection.
Yes. If you have questions that you'd like to put in the chat for Garfield, please go ahead, or you can add your question to the Q&A.
I might add that there's another interesting study that can be done with steamboat mail, and there's the steamboat mail in the interior of Ontario. The Muskokas had a rather an extensive steamboat mail system, as did the uh, St. Lawrence River steamboat system. I dare not try all of them because I can't afford it.
I also found it interesting with the trip that the mail had to take from Port Stanley to get to Lake Ontario. Very interesting.
Yeah, funnily enough, I haven't found a piece of mail coming from Port Stanley to the lake service, but I got two from the lake service to Port Stanley.
Excellent. Okay. I don't see any other questions at the moment, so I would like to thank you, Garfield, for such a wonderful presentation on our mail system on Lake Ontario. Before we close, we would like to acknowledge the lands that we're on. And thank you again to Longley Auctions. Visit longleyauctions.com and maybe you can find some Lake Ontario postal history yourself. Thank you for joining us. And please remember next week, the multiple panelists will be presenting Canada's national show. It's in our veins. Thanks very much, everyone.
By the way, don't go to Bill's looking for steamboat mail. I cleaned them out.
Okay.